evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our event. I'm Callista Chong, the chairperson of the Broad Street Humanities Review, the BSHR in short. I'll briefly introduce the BSHR for those who have joined us for the first time. So in 2019, the Broad Street Humanities Review is the University of Oxford's very first student-run undergraduate humanities journal, which aims to invigorate interdisciplinary academic writing in our student community and beyond. This term, we are thrilled to introduce a variety of panels that center on the theme time through different disciplinary lenses. In addition to hosting interesting discussions, we produce timely journal issues with the support of a talented team of writers and editors. I've also put some links in the chat that lead to our social media platforms, so feel free to check them out for regular updates and for opportunities to get involved with our publication. We'll be opening applications for next year's committee tomorrow, so please keep an eye on our socials for the announcement. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by our guest speakers, Professor Ian Golden and Dr. Andrew Edwards. Professor Golden, would you perhaps like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Thanks very much, Callista, and thanks for staying awake at 2 a.m. in Singapore for this. And congratulations to the Broad Street Humanities Review for what you're doing to encourage thinking, creative thinking around the humanities issues. I'm the Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. I was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, which is a big interdisciplinary group of well over 300 faculty across the university from about 50 departments working on solving global challenges. And since 2016, when I stepped down as director, I've been running 3 research groups in the Oxford Martin School and doing my own work. Before that, I was head of policy and vice president of the World Bank. And before that, I ran the Development Bank of Southern Africa and was economic advisor to Nelson Mandela, and some other things previously, which just shows how old I am.
Right, thank you, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Edwards, would you like to go next?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I'm Andrew Edwards. I'm the Career Development Fellow in the Global History of Capitalism Project here at Oxford. Previous to that, I did my PhD at Princeton University. And previous to that, I was a financial reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where I happened to have a front row seat to the 2008 financial crisis, which got me really interested in the history of the global financial apparatus that had seemingly imploded in that moment. Prior to that, I was a foreign correspondent in China and India for a year for various publications and a reporter in California. It's a real pleasure to be back here. Thank you again, Callista, and my own student Deepesh, who is somewhere in the row of empty boxes. And the Broad Street Humanities Review more generally. This is just a fantastic thing, bringing students together to engage in the humanities, particularly on these big global questions. So I'm really excited to be here with my distinguished opponent.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and we are very glad to have you with us today. So now we'll speak a bit about the format of today's debate on the motion, "This House believes that now is the best time to be alive." Professor Golden will first speak for the proposition, and Dr. Edwards will follow with a speech that opposes the motion. Following which, we will move into a moderated Q&A segment with the audience, so you're very welcome to submit your questions for both speakers in the chat, which I'll then read aloud on your behalf. Alternatively, you may also choose to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you'd like to ask the question yourself, but please be reminded that this session will be recorded, so if you're not comfortable with that, please just type your question in the chat. So now that all the logistical details have been accounted for, Professor Golden, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Andrew for taking up the mantle of opposing the idea that now is the best time to be alive. One has to be able to answer the question, which previous time do you think was better? If you're arguing that now is not the best time, would you like to live in the 1920s or 30s when average life expectancy was 25 years less than today? Perhaps in the 18th century, when mortality rates were 2 or 3 times what they are today, or in a previous century where you could have been a slave. If you're a woman, would you like to have lived in a previous time when you didn't have the vote? Would you, if you are young like to be alive. Infant mortality has gone down by more than 80% over the last 90 years alone. Average life expectancy increased. I would be dead at my age, most probably, if I'd been in the previous century. My life expectancy now is for about another 25 years. One of the reasons I'm happy to be alive. I also think that the pace of technological progress is so great that even for me, and certainly for all the young people that are participating, the chances of having a healthy old age are greater than ever in history. The things that we know about of dementia, of senility, which means that mental life expectancy remains behind physical life expectancy, will be conquered, as will the other great threats we face, like cancer, like climate change. Of course, I would not argue that today is perfect. There are many things that are grievously wrong, and I've spent my life fighting them. That's what the Oxford Martin School's about. That's what all my jobs have been about. And we're living this year and last through the pandemic in a particularly bad time. So you could say, well, actually, I'd rather have been alive 2 years ago rather than today. But I take the question as a broader one. It's not about 2020 isn't as good as 2019. I take it as a broader argument that this time, the 2000s, the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century is the best time to be alive. And I think it'd be very difficult to argue it wasn't. Certainly, if you were living in Eastern Europe under communism, it would be difficult to argue that life was much better then. It's not good now. There's poverty, things are bad, but it was worse then. If you, even in China, 800 million people have escaped dire poverty over the last 40 years in China. Many things that one wouldn't celebrate, but the achievements are unprecedented. And of course, Callista, you in Singapore, you know the progress that's happened in Singapore, even in your lifetime, let alone in mine. So we shouldn't confuse our determination to overcome the many things that are wrong. And I'd be the first to help build that list and the resolve to overcome inequality, climate change, remaining gender imbalances, discrimination on racial and all other grounds. Those things remain grievous, and we should redouble our efforts to make progress on them. But the fact that we are able to make progress, that we know that we are expanding our intellectual horizons, that we're expanding the horizons of our capabilities and knowledge, gives me the hope that we are in a new age of discovery. My book, Age of Discovery, compares our time to the Renaissance. And I believe we are in a Renaissance moment. We're in a Renaissance moment because of this explosion of genius, because of this potential and real creativity, which is unprecedented compared to previous eras. The Renaissance wasn't only, of course, a period of good times. It led to very bad times. Burning of books, inquisitions, the killing through guns, germs, and steel of most Native Americans, the coming back of other diseases. So progress also has an underbelly, and we should certainly focus on that underbelly and deal with it, whether it's climate change, whether it's inequality, whether it's the continuing discrimination. There are many things that come out of progress, but without this progress, we would have no knowledge. The fact that gay marriage is now allowed in 42 countries of the world, this is something that's happened in the last 20 years. The fact that the Me Too movement overnight sparked a reevaluation of men's behavior and what's acceptable and not around the world. The fact that we have a vaccine developed in 1 year, whereas previously it's never happened in less than 10, that we are vaccinating at the scale. These are all reasons to be cheerful. These are all reasons to understand that however big the threats are, we have a knowledge and a capability to address them. We didn't know about climate change, although it's been happening for over 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. We didn't really know about this until 40, 50 years ago. We didn't know until we could look back on the Earth, this beautiful blue marble, about our planet. And every day we are discovering new things about the potential, about the inequalities, about what can be done, about how we're making species extinct, but also how we can overcome them. And so I'm optimistic that by understanding, by this global knowledge platform that's been built through the World Wide Web, through unprecedented numbers of people being educated with a more rapid rate of poverty reduction until the pandemic than ever in history. And even after the pandemic, we'll still be way below the levels of poverty of 50 years ago, and hunger and malnutrition. I challenge anyone to come up with a single metric that says that this is not the best time for humans to be alive. There are greater inequalities. There are terrible things, but we know about them and we never did before. The one area where one could argue it's not a good time to be alive is, of course, if you're a species going extinct, a fish in the ocean, a butterfly, a bee. And those are certainly species which are threatened. And one could argue, I think, quite cohesively, and I would be convinced to argue that for an animal other than humans, it might not be the best time to be alive. And we need to, and I certainly am committed as a vegan, as someone that's committed to doing something about that. But that's a different, in my view, proposition to say that humans, by what I take this debating motion to be about, that this is not the best time alive for humans. And it can, I think, also be a time of rediscovery, of renaissance, where we did rediscover our relationship to nature and through that create a more sustainable world. That option did not exist. I've been trying to understand history, and I know Andrew's a historian, and I hope he speaks to this because I'm fascinated to hear more. But when we learn the lessons of history, we see that this is also one of the, despite the horrors that are happening everywhere, in many countries, this is one of the most peaceful times in human history. The number of people dying in conflict compared to previous epochs is lower. There's a lot of homicide. There's a lot of deaths from pollution and other things, and we need to stop those. But in aggregate statistics, it would be, I believe, very difficult. I look forward to Andrew convincing me, very difficult to argue that this is anything but the best time to be alive. And as I say, I challenge all the participants to say which previous time would they prefer to be alive in for themselves and those they love.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was a very compelling argument. Now let's invite Andrew to make his speech against the motion. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Callista. Thank you, Ian, for that really wonderful introduction. Thank you for inviting me to debate the notion that this house believes that now is the best time to be alive. So in the best Oxford tradition, socially distanced, I'd like to start us off with a bit of poetry and a bit of history. So as I was mulling over this topic, before I even knew which side I was going to argue, I kept returning over and over to a famous line from the English poet William Wordsworth's posthumous masterpiece, The Prelude, published in 1850. And this is the line: "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was the very heaven." So the year that inspired that sentiment was 1792, one of the climactic years of the French Revolution. The place was Paris, where Wordsworth, having completed a BA at Cambridge in 1791, had traveled on walking holiday and ended up falling in with a group of Anglophone radicals, including Thomas Paine, the philosopher of the American Revolution, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who had just published A Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the foundational texts of Western feminism. So I'm going to return to this poem in a minute, but I wanted to raise it at first at the beginning in order to press a simple point. Regardless of how privileged we might be to be alive right now, and I think that Professor Golden is quite right that we are very privileged, no one in March 2021 feels like Wordsworth did in 1792. And if you do, frankly, I wonder if there is something wrong with you. Professor Golden is quite right, of course, that we should be talking about the times in general and not the time, but nonetheless, it's worthy of a recap. Let's briefly take stock. So millions are dead the world over from COVID-19. Untold millions more are grieving. In this country and in my own, at least tens of thousands of those deaths were preventable. Children have fallen so far behind in their lessons that policymakers question whether they will ever make it up. Rather than flattening inequality, as some suggested it might at the beginning of the pandemic has exacerbated it, with the bulk of the suffering and economic and physical falling on poorer communities and especially communities of color. We've all spent months locked in our homes without parties, without concerts, without plays, without classrooms, without the quotidian human interactions, conversations, lunches, and dinners that make life at its best, for me anyway, a source of joy. And even when we are all hopefully vaccinated and the plague ends, here anyway, or in wherever you might be, I suppose in Singapore, I'm not sure how vaccination is proceeding. In the United States, it seems to be going pretty well. The UK seems ahead of everything. But nonetheless, when it ends in the richest parts of the world, it will still be ravaging much of the to come, a challenge to global health for perhaps the rest of our lifetimes. Furthermore, so if we scale up, so if we raise our heads above the plague present here and now, it's evident that in 2021, we live in a world beset by multiple crises with few obvious solutions. The embers of war are still burning in the Middle East, including a war and brutal humanitarian crisis in Yemen that shows no sign of abating. The People's Republic of China, the inheritor of an ancient and brilliant civilization, and one of the most wonderful places I've ever lived, is in the process of reducing one of the great world cities, Hong Kong, to an autocratic shadow of its former self, while perpetuating what appears to be a genocide, or at the very least a cultural extermination in its far northwest. Europe, all but united, is fragmenting again, putting at risk the economic and cultural gains of more than a half century of peace. In a word, Brexit. In the United States, my home country, an anti-democratic fascist mob stormed the US Capitol on January 6th, the first time that the US Capitol had been sacked since the British did it in 1814. Great Britain, where I happen to be currently located, recently suffered its worst economic downturn since the year of the Great Frost in 1709. Which is to say, in more than 3 centuries, which included the bursting of the South Sea bubble, numerous crashes, crunches, 2 Great Depressions, at least 2 Great Depressions, 2 world wars, and the Great Recession, apparently economically we're getting the worst of it now, afloat mostly due to unprecedented and highly welcome government support. And I've not even dipped, as Ian recently did, into the increasingly lukewarm ocean waters of the looming disaster that is human-generated climate change and extinction, which is an imminent threat to virtually every aspect of life as we know it, and yet still treated by most, not my distinguished opponent, but nonetheless most, as something akin to a lifestyle choice. The ocean is acidifying. Less than 2 weeks ago, an iceberg just slightly smaller than the area of metropolitan London calved off the Brunt ice shelf in Antarctica, part of an accelerating ice loss that is already threatening coastal communities worldwide. And as you all know, I could go on, but I won't, for one reason, which is regardless of what I say, I agree with Professor Golden on one point. There is absolutely no way one could argue that this is the worst time to be alive. Far from it. I, for one, would rather be alive now than in 1792 or in 1892. No contest. But simultaneously, I think it is specious, at the very least, to argue that now is the best time to be alive. I'm only 39 years old, and now is not even the best time to be alive since I've been alive. 1996, 2006, 2012, all were better years to be alive by almost any measure. And those are just high points I personally witnessed. But this leaves us in a quandary. Now is neither the best of times nor the worst of times, to paraphrase another 19th century writer. So how are we to judge our time against other times? Once we get past self-congratulation, what are we to make of the world that all of you will play a significant role in someday, I hope. So this brings me back to Wordsworth and the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, as many of you likely are aware, was a key moment in the development of global modernity, a time of much brutality, yes, but also of much promise. So for Wordsworth, who was 22 in 1792, it was the promise that stood out. As he admitted elsewhere in the poem, like many young people, gratefully, he saw the best in people, as opposed to their brutality and violence, which was also much in evidence that year. But the reason I returned to Wordsworth's reflections on the French Revolution is that I think it contains within it an intuition that might help us solve our dilemma, which, to reiterate, is the problem of figuring out what makes one time bliss in that dawn to be alive and another our own far less so. So one possibility raised by many who argue that now is the best time to be alive is human capacity. And Professor Golden mentioned this. The technology and intellectual wizardry that has enabled us to conduct this meeting from a safe distance has enabled for the first time the emergence of a plausible, sustainable energy economy and will, according to Elon Musk at the very least, soon send us to Mars. But as C.S. Lewis noted in his prescient and rather disturbing lectures on the abolition of man, technology is no panacea. While it claims always to be a triumph of humanity over nature or technical constraint, all technology is in fact, Lewis argued, in all times and places, the means for one person of exerting power over another. Consider the printing press. This was an invention that transformed the world, gave us the United States, at least a new freedom, the freedom of the press. But the freedom of the press, as you may learn if you go into journalism or in the place of securing a book contract, is in fact the freedom of those who own presses. This creates winners and losers, inequality, those with access, those without. The same could be said of the internet economy and the algorithms that enable it. They open up a world of information and connectivity, but at the same time, they've enabled private and public surveillance and manipulation on a scale unimaginable in human history, and unfreedom to match the freedom it provides. Technology, in short, will not save you. So there are others, and I believe Professor Golden was alluding to this, including the notable Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who argue that now is the best time to be alive because there is so much aliving to do. We live longer, we are less likely to die violently than any time in history, and that is all true. That is a fair point, except that it presupposes that the only thing worth having in life is more life. And surely that is not true. Quality of life counts, even if quantity is undoubtedly desirable. Also, and I say this with some hesitance, it seems to me to be obvious that some things, and for me these include democracy, freedom of expression, self-government, among a few others, my son for one, that are worth dying for, or at least risking death for, which is an argument against the notion that all we want from life is to continue it. So consider a test case. Is a deathless tyranny, a tyranny in which no one dies, any less tyrannical than because it is deathless? Or is it not, in fact, more so? So if technology and long life are not enough to offer a time when it was bliss in that dawn to be alive, when that seems an appropriate observation, what does? So there are many ways to answer, but in closing, I think I'd like to return to Wordsworth's poems for 3 suggestions. First, the reason it was bliss to be alive for him was because he wrote 1792 was, quote, a time in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took on at once the attraction of romance. That is to say, it was a brilliant time to be alive because it was a time when a great nation, France, was undertaking to reform its basic institutions, and young people, a recent Cambridge graduate like Wordsworth was involved, was talking to the people involved, was talking to the leading intellectuals of a day, was contributing. That is to say, it was a wonderful time to be alive, in part because democracy, where democracy was control of human affairs, seemed to be on the march. The outcome, obviously, as we know from history, was tragic, as so many things are. But the insight, nonetheless, I think has some validity. Second, it was bliss to be alive because, not merely because democracy was on the march, but because reason marched beside it. It was a time when, quote, Wordsworth writes, reason seemed to most assert her rights, when most intent on making herself a prime enchantress to assist the work which was going forth in her name. That is to say, not merely democracy on the move, and stale institutions were being revived by the people they represented, but that this transformation seemed to Wordsworth to be the work of reason, the product of educated minds at work on a project of making the world better for people as a whole. And finally, it was bliss because this reasoned democratic ferment was broadly shared, because Wordsworth wrote, quote, the meek and lofty did both find helpers in their heart's desire. The stuff at hand, plastic as they could wish, were called upon to exercise their skill, not in utopia, subterranean fields, or some secreted island, heaven knows where, but in the very world, which is the world of all of us, the place where, in the end, we find our happiness or not at all. Also, it's probably worth pointing out that in 1792, Wordsworth was in love. Nevertheless, we can leave him here. These points, I think, are worth considering because the case Wordsworth is making, and I'm ventriloquizing here, is not that merely it was the best of times, but that he and many others were actively working to make it so through democracy, through reason, egalitarianism. So in closing, I think Professor Gold and I agree. He's written this in his books anyway. I believe we are living in ambiguous times, regardless of the potential of them. They are full of potential for human flourishing, no doubt. But as Wordsworth reminds us, that times do not flourish on their own. And history reminds us that even when they do, holding on to reason, democracy, and equality may be even harder than achieving it in the first place. In sum, this may not be the best time to be alive, but it is up to all of us to help to make it so and to make it last. Thank you.
Can I come back, Callista?
Yes, sure.
Thanks you, Andrew. You did a fantastic job, and I think we agree on most things. Just a couple of things I'm not convinced about, and let's discuss them. The first is because Wordsworth felt bliss, or a small group of people felt bliss, how you define the best of times. You know, at the time when he was writing that, most people in the world were living in absolute dire poverty. Life expectancy, I think, was about 40. And of course, slavery was rampant. Women were not involved at all in what he was talking about. It was bliss for him and some people. But compared to the breadth of what we have today, it would be very, very difficult to argue that that time was sort of better for more people, or more people felt democracy on the move. I think, for example, the Me Too movement, the liberation of people, Black Lives Matter, things like that are a modern equivalent of that transformation, but much broader and much bigger than anything which has ever happened before. So that global movement, protests in 120 countries within a week of George Floyd being killed, what Greta Thunberg has mobilized on Fridays, that sort of broad-based with young people, old people, women, men, blacks, participation, not in the Cambridge bliss of a young student, but a broader improvements. My first question is, whose bliss? The second, on your quantity and quality, yes, absolutely. Not life for life's sake, the quality of life. And I'm a great fan of Amartya Sen's work on capabilities and people having the ability to lead full lives, flourishing, human flourishing. But if that is the metric, it's not only about the quality of your life and the quantity of years, it's also about how many lives. And actually, Toby Ord in the philosophy department at Oxford has written really interestingly on this with some others about if another person is having a higher quality of life, does that improve overall human welfare? If another person is being education, if another girl is getting an education, if another person is free, if another person has, and of course one can't begin to have a life unless one is alive. And that's why this sort of tension that some point to between development and freedom is one that I think Sen has nailed. You've got to be developed in order to be free. You've got to be alive. You've got to have nutrition. You've got to have education. You've got to have the capabilities that come with development to express your freedoms, and that puts things like food, shelter, education at the heart of it. And they're just more people. So it's not just the quality of an individual's life, it's the mass quality. And I think if you sort of added that up, the number of people who have a capability around the world is greater than ever. So whose best time is it, would be the second question I would pose. You're absolutely right to point to the pandemic. And I would agree that 2019 in many respects was a better year than 2020, but I didn't take that to be the motion. I took it to be generally the time we live in. Now, I've argued, I've written 2 books about this, and I'm just about to publish another book called Rescue: From Global Crisis to a Better World, that the pandemic has been, like you've said, a huge economic shock, increased inequalities dramatically of all types between young and old, income and between countries, etc. It is a huge setback, but I believe that it could be something which leads to a better world, because what we've seen governments do in their response, which is to guarantee income for people, for example, to create $12 trillion of stimulus, to create a vaccine in a year. There are many things in the response that give us hope that actually we could have, as Arundhati Roy has said, a portal to a new world. Now, as you say, I'm not saying we're getting there, but the potential exists because we have that knowledge and things. You pointed to the printing press and the double-edged sword, and that's what my book Age of Discovery is all about. Absolutely. And of course, you didn't even mention fake news and the destructive ideas that get reproduced through printing presses, Nazism, one example, but many, many others, Trumpism. Having said all that, the fact we have a battle of ideas is progress in itself, because the scariest thing is as you pointed to, when there's no battle of ideas. The reason we have battles of ideas is because of this contested space, because more people are educated, more people have access, etc. How we overcome fake news is a big, big challenge, not least in anti-vaccination movements. But the fact that knowledge power exists, I think, is progress. So I take your points. I think you make many good points, but I do not believe that they add up to an argument that it would be better to live in a different time. I also take your point, and I think you're right, that we don't know what the future is. Maybe there's a better time in the future, and I certainly hope so. That's everything we fight for, must be for that. So I absolutely, if there isn't a better time in the future, that's pretty depressing. If progress isn't going to happen. So I absolutely take your point that if the motion is to be that now is the best time to be alive, includes the future, well, is an unknowable, and I hope the motion is wrong. But I have taken the motion to be, now is the best time to be alive of the human history that we know, the past and the present. And if that's the motion, I would stick to my view that despite the huge wrongs of the present, it's still a better time than the past.
Right. Thank you very much, Ian. Andrew, would like to respond to that.
Oh yeah, I would love to respond to that. First of all, Professor Golden, your final statement that, you know, if the future is included, I hope this is not the best time to be alive. I fully share that. I doubt it, but then I have a very young son, so it makes me, you know, it's sort of that sort of flips your understanding of both the present and the past, I think, in very significant ways. And I absolutely share your commitment to the notion that and then in fact, my entire argument was pointing towards the notion that we need, in fact, to not rest on our laurels, not to think that just because humanity has accomplished certain things technologically or has increased life expectancy or has improved the quality of life in any numerous number of ways, we cannot forget that all of those advances have come at the cost of environmental degradation, have come at the cost of new forms of coercion and control, have come at the cost of new challenges to democracy and self-government. And we must redouble our efforts, I think, both to overcome some of the sort of fallbacks of those advances and to both envision a world that we would prefer to be living in on more than merely demographic terms. I think that that's absolutely necessary, because a world in which we all live forever, and, you know, basically is the world of Wall-E. I don't know if you guys have all seen the movie, but, you know, if we're all living in floating capsules around a dead planet Earth, watching infinite Netflix, I mean, it would be sort of like 2020, but it it would not be sort of my vision of a perfect future. But to get to your point, to your specific question. So the first was, whose bliss? So I immediately, of course, I knew when I was bringing up Wordsworth and sort of one, slightly misguided youth, I think, in his own opinion. So he later recanted his allegiance to the French Revolution. The woman he was in love with, he had a daughter with that year in 1792, because of the war that was declared subsequently between England and France. He had to abandon her in France. He didn't see her for another 9 years. It was just this absolutely horrific tragedy. Absolutely. I'm not trying to say that we should all be aspiring to be William Wordsworth, though if there were more poets of that caliber, that would not be a terrible thing. Or B, that his bliss, and somehow because that one individual, you know, at a hotel, eating dinner with Thomas Paine was so significant, that sort of outweighs the bliss of the time. Rather, I was trying to speak to a certain quality of the bliss, a quality of agency, a quality of the ability to make change that Wordsworth is pointed to. And I completely share your sentiments regarding the Me Too movement, regarding Black Lives Matter, regarding the democracy movements in the Middle East, the protests in Hong Kong, which I was already pointing to. In general, the social justice movements, which in some ways have been superpowered by the internet, in other ways been sort of super disempowered by the internet. I fully am in sympathy with that point. But one of the things I would say from my own participation in those protests over the years, from the first protest against the Iraq war in 2001 down to the present, is that a part of those protests, even though they can be very joyful events, even though I highly recommend to all young people to go to as many protests as you can, you will not regret it. I don't think you'll regret it. Despite that, another part of the character of those protests is that they seem to be pushing up against a wall. There is only a limited amount of change. I remember being on a bus to San Francisco during the 2001 Iraq War protests, and this very young activist was telling me about the 1,000 monkey theory, about 999 monkeys perhaps won't type Shakespeare, but at one point there will be a monkey who will get the job done. And when you go to a protest, you're making the bet that you're going to be that 1,000th monkey. You're going to be the person who pushes over the edge. And of course, in that moment, George Bush's response to these protests, which millions of people across the United States, in many ways comparable to the marches after George Floyd's death, was to do absolutely nothing, was to disempower mass action. And I think that we have to take that into account. We have to take that into account when people are able, yes, that's true, to express themselves more broadly than ever before, to organize in a certain sense more broadly than ever before, but are they more broadly than ever before able to make real social change? I would argue that no. However misguided you think, for instance, the figures of the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Haitian Revolution or the revolutionaries of Latin America in the 19th century may or may not have been, they nonetheless made massive transformations in their social life. They had a kind of agency over sort of their basic organizational structures that I don't think is in any way comparable to the movements that we see today. I'm not saying that necessarily we want to be in a time of revolution. Nonetheless, I think that it is really important to point out that that sort of ability to change, that sort of democracy in action, is something that's worth striving for, and something that we in no way, this generation has. The second question you had was sort of the numbers game story. More people and more times. Steven Pinker's book, I think, is absolutely fantastic on this point on a certain level, but one of the points he has to make in his sort of very, very long preamble to his extraordinarily long book, which I have sitting next to me, is that in order to make this argument, you have to turn it into percentages. So you were bringing up individuals. You were bringing up, the woman who's more empowered. It is better, of course, to be an African American in the United States today than it was in 1960. Absolutely, on its individual level, the present is sort of on this more or less sort of steep improving incline from the past. But in order to make that argument, you have to make it a percentage game. You have to say that, yes, millions and millions of people died in these wars. Millions of people have obviously died in the COVID pandemic. But as a percentage of living humanity, it was extraordinarily small. And that percentage of people who've died violently or who've died in sort of less than agreeable ways has gone down over time. But nonetheless, I think that when you do that, what you're doing on a certain level, when you appeal to statistics like that, as you've done repeatedly in your argument, you are nonetheless implicitly devaluing the individual lives. For instance, the 6 million people who died in the Holocaust, for instance, all these people who in Pinker's figures make it ever shrinking percentages of humanity, but nonetheless represent entire cultures which are being wiped off the face of the earth and had been wiped off the face of the earth in his sort of improving story of the 20th century. So in sum, we do agree on many things, but I would like to hear your response to my rebuttal. Thank you.
Sorry, Ian, I think you might be muted.
Let me be brief because I'm sure there are a number of questions and we only have another 10 minutes. But I would disagree with the idea that there's not revolution in the air, or that there's not that it's all there was somehow then in the past, and now we're just sort of fighting with shadows, which is what you sort of implied. My country, South Africa, where I was engaged in the struggle, I actually never thought I would ever go back to South Africa in my lifetime, because I thought it would just end in a bloody civil war. And I do still believe that revolution was a miracle, but it wasn't just that. What I came to recognize, that in the 10 years following the fall of the Berlin Wall, 65 countries became democratic. I mean, you speak to people in Chile or Argentina or Brazil. Of course, there's terrible things happening and setbacks, but they're not in the military dictatorships they were. Or the authoritarian states. Speak to someone in Poland, even under the current Polish regime, which is not nice in my view. It's not like it was. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. To say these things didn't happen, that there hasn't been this process, or even in Myanmar today, yes, it's desperate, but there's revolution in the air. I mean, people are taking to the streets and giving their lives. To say this is all just sort of, as I think you implied, not like it used to be in some way. I just don't get that. I don't think it's right, and I think it undermines the suffering and the lives that people are giving for change around the world in many ways, including in the extinction movement and things. The second thing I would disagree with is that there's don't lump me in the same basket as Steve Pinker. I wrote a critique of him in Nature, which he wasn't that happy with, because I think he is slightly Panglossian. I mean, he only focuses on the positives and doesn't. And unless you crystal clear and magnify, put a magnifying glass on the negatives, you can never address them. You can't address climate change without focusing on it. You can't address gender discrimination or the discrimination against Uyghurs in China or anything, unless you put a magnifying glass on them. So I don't think one should say everything's great, but that's different to saying that the time is great. And I think it's hugely problematic. On the big numbers game, I don't think it's the case that because one somehow says a smaller, certainly not for me and where I come from, that because you're saying that a smaller share of humanity is dying, it's better. I'm not talking about the 1930s or 40s when it wasn't a smaller share of humanity. I'm talking about the post-1990 period, basically, as our time. That's what I think of as our time, and particularly the current decade of, or the current millennium as our time. It's not to say that because on average things are improving, Darfur is not happening or the genocide's not happening into the Rohingya people or elsewhere. It's to say that that is even more important because around the world, people are discovering change. And if you don't accept that, for me, gay marriage is a big thing. The fact that Ireland had a gay prime minister, I think is a huge deal in the course of history. I think it's different and would not have happened 50 years ago. Or that my country allows gay marriage too. 40 countries do. I think it's a massive deal, as Sim, the recent TV series has shown. And there's also a spread of good information. I don't want to take up more time, but I think saying that on average things are improving and that on average it's a better time is in no way to say happening. But the fact we know about them and are doing something about it, to me, is in part of the reason I'm feeling optimistic. And I absolutely agree with you. I've also got young kids. I absolutely agree that let's hope that the future is better. If this is the peak, if this is peak humanity, that'll be a depressing thought. And I also absolutely agree with you on techno. I'm not a techno optimist. Technologies are dual edge. They can kill us or they can save us. And it's up to humans and human agency that's going to determine what they do.
Thank you very much, Ian and Andrew. That was a really intriguing debate, and I'm very interested to see what our audience has to say to this. So currently I see 2 hands being raised. So I'll call Jamie first. Please ask your question or deliver your rebuttal.
Thanks. So I had a little speech prepared before we started, so I'm going to try and rock through it really quickly because I know we're limited for time. But I've got 3 kind of broad points. The first one is to really reintroduce the future into this debate. The second one is to rise to Ian's challenge. What human challenges exist that render this time not the best time to be alive? And the final one is to kind of think beyond politics and economics and start thinking a bit more existentially, perhaps. So on this first point about the future, let's imagine that the Romans, Cicero is debating, is this the best time to be alive? Perhaps with Julius Caesar or Pompey the Great or something ridiculous, right? We would think, looking back on that time, that solely discussing the situation of the Greeks or the Persians in relation to the Republic and where that's headed, we wouldn't think that's the best way to talk about the debate. We'd want to think more about, or partly at least, about where the Romans are headed, what they've achieved, and what is going to be achieved on the basis of the systems they've set up. And I think that is precisely what we need to be thinking a little bit more about, as well as about the past. And so I think one of the things that would be argued in the Romans' cases is that there are certain systems that the Romans set up which would lead to a significant amount of progress, but there are also certain systems which were problematic and engendered inequalities and so forth. And I think that's part of the issue here, because in order to argue what Ian's arguing, we have to simultaneously argue that where we've got to is brilliant and yet the future will not get any better, which is a very difficult argument to make. And I think Ian's risen to it brilliantly, but I'm not sure we can really discount this aspect of the debate. Precisely because I think one of the issues people want to draw out is that the system we're living in is one which potentially seems to be precluding us from positive change in the future. Look at Trump, look at Brexit, look at the pandemic. These perhaps seem to point negatively towards the future. And that seems to reflect poorly on the present. And if we feel that the future is going to get better, then I think that's actually extremely relevant. The second is Ian's challenge. What is it that might, and what human challenge exists that might render this time not the best time to be alive? And I think one of the things which is going to link to my next point, but which is really important to consider on its own, is mental health. Because I think the issues of mental health are often or have been prioritized behind physical health in the past, but actually we're seeing the importance of it today, which is in itself brilliant. But we're also seeing that it is its own pandemic. The MHFA said that 1 in 4 adults had mental health difficulties, and during the pandemic this has only gone up. It's skyrocketing. You only have to look at various figures to see that. I think there's definitely a valid claim to be made, but there's something about the system we're currently living in, the system over the past 20, 40 years, has caused a great rise in skyrocketing of mental health. I think we shouldn't see this as just, it's brilliant that many people have the physical necessities for life, but I think mental health very severely undermines, for example, Sen's capabilities that you talked about, and undermines the ability to flourish and to pursue the good life that I think a lot of people such as Pink are going to want to speak about. I think another challenge perhaps is looking at future pandemics. The World Health Organization has said that this is in some ways a baby pandemic. This is the practice. And I think that that's a very significant worry, and the science isn't looking hugely positive for that. And I think what's particularly worrying about the present moment in that regard is when we look at the worries about future pandemics or indeed bacterial resistance, sensible decisions are not being made at all. To quote, I think, the previous Lord Chairman of Goldman Sachs, that we're handing out antibiotics like candy, and it's not going to end well. And the fact that current sensible decisions or acceptable responses aren't being made, I think, reflects really poorly on the present and suggests it's not the best time to be alive. But finally, and I think the crucial point is to look beyond politics and economics and to think about the quality of life in this more existential way. Would we want to accept 200 years of life in the conditions outlined by Huxley in Brave New World? I would say no, and I would fight, probably put my life on the line, as Andrew puts it, to ensure that wouldn't happen. I'd much rather 50 years of life in the present world. And the same can be said of other dystopian, 1984, Fahrenheit 451. And I think there are some very, very valid comparisons between those books and the present situation. And I think what one might want to argue is that the issues such as mental health or the problems exposed by the pandemic to a very flawed current reality of the capitalist system are ones which preclude the possibility of getting a good quality of life. And whether or not we feel that capitalism is the best or worse, I'm not going to get into that debate. I think what's very clear is the present reality of that system is definitely not at its best. Far from it. It's a really, really messed up one. And it's one which I think in many ways, it undermines people's ability to have power over their life. I think people are more powerless actually than ever before. And while there are certain groups of people that have definitely been empowered, I think overall the general trend is a disempowerment for most people and kind of the privileging of power in the hands of the few. I think we see that people are currently engaged in struggles of endless work, and they're constantly doing more and more work since the agricultural revolution, for example. I think There's Yuval Noah Harari, who says work time has just gone up and up and up. It's the greatest hoax in history. And I agree, you know, similarly with the points about technology undermining quality of life if we look at things like pharmaceuticals and chronic health. So I'll leave it there, but I think those are three kind of critiques against Ian on the favour of Andrew. But great job to both of you, and it was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Andrew, would you perhaps like to respond to Jamie's points?
Well, there's a lot there. I tend to agree with much of it. I mean, I'm a historian of capitalism for precisely the reason that you raised, in the sense that it seems to be that capitalism as a system, and this is in a lot of ways just following on work that Thomas Piketty did in his Capital in the 21st Century. Is in a lot of ways it's a system that mechanically is going to produce inequality if, and this is a huge if, and actually it's the subject of his more recent book, democracies and democracy in general cannot produce an antidote to that. And one of the reasons that it's really important to study the past, I think, and to study the development of capitalism as a system, is to show that this is a fight that's been going on for a really long time. There's been a lot of different possibilities, and that the world that we live in is not the only possible world in that particular regard, in that particular valence, and that there is room for change if there is democratic will for change. Sort of make that point and pass it on to Dipesh before we end the hour, though I think we just have.
Right,
thank you very much for your comment.
Great. Dipesh, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And like Jamie briefly touched upon in his third point, I guess my rebuttal isn't necessarily against a particular speaker, it's more against how this whole debate has been framed and the thoughts that have gone into this whole debate. So Golden, you mentioned, you know, from a macro perspective, really, we've seen life expectancy, technology, cultural capital, you know, really on almost every perspective, we've progressed further today. Now, Andrew, you're talking, you spoke a bit of time looking at micro fluctuations. You know, all of the previously mentioned are applicable, but compared to 2006, 2012, etc., we're worse off given COVID, Brexit, political landscapes in America, China, surveillance, etc. But I feel the question is different. The question is, really, is today the best time to be alive? And the perspectives we've seen so far, they don't necessarily answer or say whether it's the best time to be alive. You know, we're not really addressing whether happiness or welfare today is any better. And Jamie briefly touched on this. You know, we're looking at levels. We're looking at you know, whether a higher life expectancy makes life better or not today. But it doesn't. So, for instance, we cannot just say life expectancy, a longer life is necessarily better. And, you know, to give a counterfactual, would an infinite life be a life always worth living? And more so, would each day of that infinite life be any better than each day of a finite life? On incomes, sure, today we have incomes that are higher than ever, but why does an income on its own make each day any better than a life in which you have a lower income? Sure, it may reduce risks and open opportunities, but it doesn't necessarily imply a higher level of happiness or welfare. And I'll return to this point in a second. So I think the question really looks at, you know, temporality. You know, the best time to be alive implies some sort of temporal perspective. So we can't just use perspectives based on levels, but we need to see, and perhaps one way we can resolve this paradox is through seeing the number of meaningful and value enriching interactions we have each day. You know, if we have more interactions each day or more events that are value enriching, you can make the argument that that day is a life that is better than a day in which you have fewer value enriching interactions or events. And you can then therefore say that welfare has increased. But can you really say that through this perspective, we're better off and that life has really improved? And more so, you can potentially make the argument that we've actually eroded the number of these interactions or these events in this temporal manner that you can view the argument. So Jamie was mentioning this, but we've set up society in a way that high incomes, a big house, etc., is seen as the optimal way to live. So you have people who leave university and become lawyers or investment bankers and work 90 hours a week. Yeah, they're earning a lot of money, their life expectancies are very high, but is it necessarily meaningful? And what this also means is that we have people at the bottom of society, the other end, relying on food banks, spending all of their time merely trying to survive. And where's their meaningful interactions? How is life better off for them? And this is all because of how we've constructed society and how society has moved to this sort of capitalist, person eat person way of living. So sure, on incomes, on technological progress, on life expectancy, on all these levels, we have progressed today. I'm not arguing against that. But I think in this debate, we've perhaps forgotten what the true essence of the question is. One, on what actually makes life worth living in terms of these value enriching interactions, and two, on this temporal aspect. And there isn't much evidence, I think, to say that this is any better today. Today's world is competitive, it's person versus person, eat what you kill, etc. And the economist in me says that, of course, such a capitalist model pushes forward all of these levels, technology, human capital, etc. But does it necessarily make life any more worth living, which is what the question really is asking? And I'm not so sure. And more so, is this time any better than a previous time? And I'm not a historian, so I wouldn't be able to answer that. So again, I'm not entirely sure, but I think what we can say is that this movement of society to what it is today doesn't necessarily make life any better worth living, but it has, increased and made better all of these perspectives, life expectancy, technology, cultural capital that we have discussed so far.
Thank you very much, Deepesh. Perhaps Ian, would you like to go first?
I'm gonna. How long is the session? I thought we were ending at 7.
Yes, apologies that it's overrunning for a bit.
I'm gonna have to. So I just wanted to thank you all. I thought Deepesh and Jamie's points were excellent. And we could carry on discussing this, and I hope we do, over drinks and in the real world, because these are vital questions, and I really would look forward to engaging with you, Callista and Deepesh and Andrew and Jamie on them. These are really important. But my sense is we've aired all the questions, and I agree with many of them, but one can debate them in different ways. And I'm also aware that it's past 3 in the morning for you in Singapore, so we should let you go to engage. I've found it very stimulating. Thanks to Andrew for taking it on. I think you've done a brilliant job, and to Deepesh and Jamie, great points that were made.